لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله.
The quote we shared earlier. Wanted to bring one point because Sister Zainab, she mentioned how the difficult part from this quote that I will read. First, I'll read the quote to put into context. Eventually, one has to come to appreciate and to give more time to being quiet and to meditation. It's interesting. He separated these two. Time for being quiet and time for meditation. On the other hand, one has to acknowledge that the whole idea of search, meaning the spiritual search and the seeking, entails a process. When one speaks of meditation, one has to take into the account the preparation to be able to meditate. Most people's minds and feelings run away with them. We get carried away, in other words, with our thoughts and feelings. We associate, meaning we connect and identify with them entirely. We associate rather than actually thinking. It's a very important line. When you're actually thinking, you're consciously thinking. That's not the same as being carried away, as most of us are most of the time, by our thoughts and feelings. We can cultivate certain modes of thinking. When you're reading and concentrating, for those who are intellectuals, you're thinking at that time. Or you can cultivate an attitude and think about it consciously, or work on a project to whatever it is, worldly, spiritual, whatever. And be consciously, actively thinking. That's not the same as being carried away by your thoughts. Not the same. One is, in his terms, association, right? And the other is real thinking, real process, right? They're being done, in other words, from two different places in you. One by nafs, by unconsciousness, and one from a place of, or even partial consciousness, as I suggested in some other post. And one from a more grounded or whole sense of consciousness. When one speaks of meditation, one has to take into the account the preparation to be able to meditate. Most people's minds and feelings run away with them. We associate rather than actually think. We react rather than actually feel in a true way. It's one thing to be carried away by the thoughts in your mind, but it's another matter to think from your heart and to feel from your heart. We often feel a feeling, or we often say we speak of feeling, but there's also thinking from the heart. This is when the intellect is sunken into the heart and you're intellecting from the center of your being. This is possible. You speak from the center of your being. You can see from the center of your being. You can move and walk and touch and feel from the center of your being. When I love him, I become the hearing with which he hears, the seeing with which he sees, the hand with which he touches, and the feet with which he or she walks. God is saying this through the Prophet ﷺ. This hadith itself demonstrates that happening. Isn't that amazing? Right? And a very beautiful insight. Right? It's Allah speaking authoritatively through the mouthpiece of the Prophet ﷺ as the person of the Prophet ﷺ, but it is not revelation. It's his words. It's inspiration of hadith. Let's see. And so here, right, it's not just God's revelation. It's actually God speaking through and as the Prophet, you can say. This is hadith Qudsi, even in, this is the sacred utterance, because it's even beyond the Prophet, but is the Prophet. You cannot say that about the Quran. That is God's speech, but even though you may have heard it first in Muhammad's speech, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Isn't that interesting that we have this in fiqh, the distinction between wahi, Quran revelation, and hadith, saying of the Prophet, but here the in-between state of hadith Qudsi, where God is speaking, but it's not the Quran, it's a hadith, right? So when God says that I am of the opinion of my servant, it's God speaking, but it's a hadith, so it's a saying of the Prophet, right? So the Prophet here, he did not say in these states, he's not saying, hey guys, stop for like, hey, come, companions, God's about to speak. He's speaking. God is speaking in the first person, and the companions know. That's amazing. How spiritual is that? Speaking from the heart, speaking from the center of your being that has awakened to the divine presence and to the divine love in such a way that your attribute falls away and the divine attribute is speaking through your attributes. I am the hearing with which he hears. I am the seeing with which he sees. I am the hand with which he touches. We react rather than feel in a true way. And to be able to meditate means to be able to withdraw part of this associative thinking. This requires a concentration and an ability to be here in this moment of now, listening from the heart. And I am the hearing with which he hears. Right? The awakened heart is God's presence hearing in you, through you, I dare say, as you. For God says this himself through the mouthpiece of the Prophet ﷺ. Letting something enter which we ordinarily block, veil ourselves from. Right? In terms of the challenge of to be able to concentrate, I invite you to the beginning of this quote for the key. Eventually, one has to come to appreciate and to give more time to being quiet. Coming to appreciate a thing means that you've struggled with it and you've come to appreciate it. And appreciating means you really understand why it's so important. Existentially, you have verified the purpose of being more silent. You've come to appreciate silence because it tells you something about what you really are and what you thought you were. So you're not the sounds and the words and the thoughts in your head. You're not. You're more the silence than that speech. Simply be quiet and come to appreciate this. The more you appreciate this, the more you verify and you know what you are. That's what grounds you ultimately in consistency. When you come to appreciate what you really are, the struggling begins to level off because now you understand beyond your efforting of where you were operating from and what you actually are and why you need to appreciate that more and that you appreciate, you come to appreciate. When this happens, all the rest occurs. This is one of the goals, you could say, or landmarks of the meditative work, to discover what you are internally, what your real self is and what you thought you were. That this space then opens when you come to appreciate this. Allah opens it in these gates first of Wellbeing, the human presence. Then in Allahu Hadari, God is present. God is lovingly watching me, Allahu Nadari, and God is intimately one with me in my experience, my inward and my outward, Allahu Ma'i. I love him, as the hadith says, until I love him and I am the hearing with which he hears. This is Allahu Hadari, you could say. And the seeing is also kind of then, and the seeing with which he sees, Allahu Nadari. And then the hand with which he touches. I am the touching with which he touches. And the stepping and the moving with which he moves. This is Allahu Ma'i. This presence has come outward now. It awakened inwardly and now it comes out. So all the gates, everything is there. And all, even the pre-gate is in this hadith, right? My servant, never ceases to draw near unto me, or burst by the obligations, and right, loving to me is that my servant, right? So that's human presence, and we enter the divine presence, and then finally the prophetic presence, and it is from the prophetic presence that this hadith is being stated. So this really is the key, to come to appreciate this in your practice. The more you practice, the simple answer always is just do more practice and verify for yourself what's actually happening. The more you do this, you will come to appreciate it as your real self. The more you appreciate it as your real self, the more natural it will become. The more natural it becomes, the less you will be carried away by your own nonsense. Your own no sense. Right? Until you now speak and live from your meaning, your experienced meaning.
What's interesting about this hadith, like what you're pointing out, that in one respect, it's like when the Prophet speaks, he's actually enacting the hadith, like that's happening for him at the moment.
You can say that.
But
it's an expression. It's an expression of it.
Exactly, it's an expression of it. But even as the hadith descends from God speaking, and it's coming to the tongue of the Prophet, and it's reaching us, right? That's the path as well, because you go back that way. You see the Prophet, for example, the word you say you return back to yourself, then you open the Prophet, the prophetic presence, and then you reach the Shahada.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. So all of the path is in the trajectory of this hadith, right? Lovable to me is that my servant performed that which I love, which is the fara'id, the obligatory, and then the nawafil, the voluntary, until I love him, not just his actions or her actions, which bring her near me, but actually until I love him, and I love him now. Now the divine attributes, the witnessing of the attributes of God are unveiled. I am the hearing. God assumes or subsumes your attributes. They fall away and assumes his attributes in you, and shows you this. So when God says this, he is telling you he will show you this, that you will verify this. So you're right that on every step of the way it is this process. A question came up within the context of the contemplative work. Would you mind sharing some insights or words on the relationship between sending halawat, integration on a micro and macrocosmic level, and eternity? This sounds like I have to respond with a PhD thesis here. Difficult in 1 minute to try to. What you can say is that the Prophet, Sallallahu or prophecy as such is this intermediary, celestial intermediary between the cosmos and you, or the divine source and you, and it is the means that brings us more near God or integrates us. So the short answer is that that is the cosmic function of prophecy, personified in the spirit of the Prophet ﷺ and his body, his form. And one sees this in that very verse, Inna Allah wa malaikatahu yusalluna ala nabi ya ayyuhalladhina amanu sallu alayhi wa sallimu taslima, which means verily God and the angels send prayers upon, or sending blessings upon the Prophet. O ye who believe, join the celestial party, right? Join this celestial event and connect yourselves to the Prophet ﷺ. through God so that you are connected more to God and the angels. So you see how the prophet is the bridging function. The prophetic function is a bridging function microcosmically, macrocosmically, celestially, spiritually. Hope that's helpful, inshallah. So we'll end here, inshallah. Yes, one comment or question?
Well, had it said about what you were speaking about when the prophet, when he spoke, when a hadith Qudsi came out, his companions would know, right, that this is God speaking through the tongue of the prophet. And it occurs to me that in Christianity, what happened was that distinction wasn't made.
Yes, this
So
is a very profound
when
point.
Christ was speaking as God, they didn't make that distinction.
Yes, yes.
But in Islam, they really make that distinction.
Yes, and this is a profound point. I think maybe some may or may not have heard. I'm sure you all heard it. That that in the life of Christ, this particular distinction or awareness may not have been kind of present when Jesus spoke. Was the Father speaking? Was Jesus speaking? And this part of this has to do with his own function, right? Of esoterically, spiritually, that he himself was the revelation. So when he was speaking, there was this kind of merging, right? Which then in formal expression may have been ambiguous, right? The Quran speaks of, or Allah speaks through the Quran, stating that the Quran itself is a revelation in it, which has clear hukamat, right? Which has clear words and sayings and rulings, hukamat and wisdoms, and some that are mutashabihat, that are ambiguous, unclear, right? And only those who are rooted in knowledge, firmly rooted in the knowledge of God, know the distinction and understand the meanings of the mutashabihat, of those which are unclear, ambiguous, even esoteric. You could say that the muhkamat are exoteric, and that the mutashabihat are esoteric, right? And you can use this interpretation. And so, whereas the Quran, it is kept a distinct, and even Muhammad Sallallahu as the messenger, as the prophetic embodiment, there's a distinction between the Lord and the servant in him. There was a kind of confusion or a union without confusion, as Christian theology would say, with the nature of Christ and what it was, right? That it was both divine and human, but because of this, in its respective revelation, there was ambiguity in his speech. Sometimes clarification, but less muhkamat and more mutashabihat in his revelation that was him in his life. And this, one can say, is what led to the debates theologically of what he was. This was the number one question: what was Jesus? For the first 400 years, 500 years of Christendom. What was Jesus? Was he divine? Was he human? Was he neither? Or was he both? This, philosophically speaking and theologically speaking, this is the same question asked in Islam. Also somewhat central, but not as central, but still very important. Well, what is the nature of the Quran? Is it a divine speech? Is it created speech? What do we say? Is it eternal, right? Or is it temporal?
Well, so,
right?
and what you're saying about how in the case of Christ, like basically the levels were not respected, where the Lord was the Lord, the servant was a servant. But even on an existential level that occurs with Christ. There's a confusion of levels when it comes to Christ because he's created without a father.
Exactly. So the point here is that there is a divine intentionality, and this is the point I was implying, not being explicit, but that God intended the revelation that you could say spiritually is Jesus to be ambiguous. And that was their test. That was a test, a very hard test. Right? But God intended that. He, subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allahu alam, he emphasized the divine immanence rather than the transcendence that's emphasized in Islam, which returns things back to equilibrium. right? Which meets a healthy medium between the transcendence and immanence. When you compare the revealed wisdoms of Judaism or the Mosaic revelation with the Christic revelation and the Muhammadan revelation, if the Mosaic goes towards the way of transcendence, that there's a God and there's a people and there's a contract between them that binds them, there's thereby distance between them, but they're chosen. It is contractual. There is actually with Christ a kind of immanence, right? What then is a kind of merging, a falling away, a movement to immanence, of the divine immanence, that the fullness of God's presence revealed as Christ or his followers, which then abrogates, as it were, the transcendence and separation and the contract. It's not about fear of God or about action. It's about love. And in love, there's mergers and there's the blurring of boundaries. It was meant cosmically to redress this revelational emphasis. But then this brought its own challenges, right? To each people, we gave a law and a way to test them with what we gave them, according to Surah Al-Ma'idah, to test them with what we gave them. Each revelation had its test. And then we have the final in the ternary of monotheisms, a return to an equilibrium, an Abrahamic equilibrium of the outer form and the inner reality. In Christ, the inner reality, hakika, manifested itself. And this became mutashabihat, or became this mutashabih, or ambiguous, for everyone. This is why it was like, what is Jesus? But then there was a return to equilibrium as the final revelation of keeping or making the distinction between the outward and the inward, the muhkamat and the mutashabihat, the exoteric and the esoteric, transcendence and immanence. This is why we have, so if the Mosaic revelation emphasized Sharia and the Christic revelation emphasized haqiqa, or you could say tariqa, then you have haqiqa with Sharia and tariqa balanced, right? Or Sharia and haqiqa, if you want to use that, balanced as tariqa, right? And so then we come back around to a kind of cosmic equilibrium. And so these archetypes, you can say, play themselves out spiritually, these revealed archetypes. I'm not just speaking of the Jungian archetypes that has its own wisdom in its own place, but I mean divine archetypes, that they play a role in the revelations. And so you see them in the cycles and the emphases and the ternary here of these major revelations that are part of the Abrahamic archetype, right? One emphasizing the transcendence, one immanence, then one perfection, right? So you have Jalal, Jamal, and then Kamal, right? So you have majesty, you have your beauty. So majesty in Moses, you have your beauty in Jesus, and then you have perfection in Muhammad. What's amazing is that that's the emphasis of each revealed archetype in these, the presiding idea of these revelations, right? And so they all have a place. And wisdom pertains to those who see this, to recognize that Jesus was not our test. He was not our blessing or our test, as he is for the Christians. The Muhammad and what was revealed to him is our blessing and our test. To test them with that which we gave them, as the Surah Al-Ma'idah says. So each ummah received a test, or received a blessing, which also tested them. Right? So this is how one can. So I say all this to respond to what you said. I say all this to respond to your Sufi and Islamic theological criticism of Christian theology, that yes, but also no. And in the yes and the no is splits the minds from the bodies, right? The spirits from the, right? This is what Ibn Arabi says. But in the yes and the no is the subtle
Wait,
pointer.
and when he says that
Allah.
spirits are separated from their matter,
Yes, from their bodies. Yes, exactly.
which is the whole thing with
Yes,
Christ.
and the key is to combine both, right? So that spirit expresses itself as body, and the body is illuminated by the spirit. Allahu alam. But so, what were you asking, Heidi Haider?
What's the test
For the Muhammadan Ummah?
Yeah, in particular, they can, is it a
To
thermometer?
I could attempt that. I can attempt that. You can say it's a test. The test is to receive perfection and not be veiled by it, so that you may see it in others and yourself. So I will end with that. This is why one can say that the doctrine of Tawheed is so profound, so clear, concise, and profound in Islam that it blinds us from seeing Tawheed in other religions. And that when we don't see it like we see it in our religion, we think it's not even there and we reject them. But yet it is there. It's at the heart of their religions. Maybe not in the same language.
And it could be like for the non-Jews within the Ummah, maybe they're like, how come it's not in our religion? Is that also a test as well?
It's a test because, as Abistadi says, since we're trying to get to this level, that even religion itself is idol worship when compared to the pure oneness of God. For we've made oneness a form, and oneness is formless. La ilaha illallah, even when it's said, points to the formless oneness, the formless oneness. This is what the spiritual mystic or the Arif Billah knows. And so when you contain it in a form, in as much as it is permitted by God and willed by God, we follow. But in as much as we only see that oneness in this form, we have succumbed to a subtle form of idol worship. So this is one example of the blindness. So Allah Ta'ala Alam, I'll leave it there. My point here is to appreciate and to stay open, but also to recognize the authority of our path for us. Right? Stay open to the self disclosures of the oneness of the divine presence in others or other things, not just religions, but other souls of human beings, of other beings and things, of all of creation. So the Sufi contemplative is the one who witnesses in Allahu Ma'i, in this station, the oneness of God, his signs, his self-disclosures in all things. In this is a transcendent unity of being and witnessing. That's the real oneness. Right? And now it's an embodied oneness of witnessing God's oneness and presence in all things, inward and outward. And we shall show them our signs of our oneness upon the horizons outside of them, of the horizons of other religions, of their, of nature, of other human beings, of their souls, other journeys, and within themselves, until it becomes more clear, or it is clear that it is the truth, or he is the truth. This is the verse. Right? And is it not sufficient that God is the witness of all things? He is the pure witness in all of this. And it's only God who witnesses, actually. Then you will finally see that sign. And that's pure mushahada. Allah Ta'ala alam, but we'll have to end here. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdik. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
لا إله إلا الله 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 لا إله إلا الله